Hello, everybody. It's me again, Mr. Greer, and today we're going to take a look at our reading and writing assignments. We're going to start today with lesson 5 on voting rights. So, in your book, this is page 50, and you all can take a look at the vocabulary words on your own and look at their meanings and such. That'll help you work on page 51 as you learn how to use the vocabulary words. Just to make sure our pronunciation's down correctly, we have allow, barrier, competition, consistent, cooperation, deny, eligible, emphasize, influence, interpret, ballot, legislation, literacy, register, and suffrage. So those are all the vocabulary words. You can take a look at these, the meanings on your own, and that'll help you to go ahead and complete page number 51 using the knowledge you have of the words to answer the various questions. What I do want to focus on right now is the actual reading. So you guys are going to do the reading on your own, but I do want to take care of the pre-reading. So you all remember this acronym, THIEVES, right? THIEVES stands for the title, the headings, the introduction, every first sentence, vocabulary, end of chapter questions, and the summary. All right. Now, there are two different texts that we're going to look at. We have from the 15th Amendment. So, text 1 is an article about voting rights for African Americans. And text 2 is some info adapted from What a Colored Man Should Do to Vote. And this is an early 1900s pamphlet. So when I'm not going to read this, we're just going to do the pre-reading on it together, all right? So the first letter is T, which is the title. And the title here is an article about voting rights for African Americans. So automatically we can kind of tell this is going to be talking about voting rights. About voting rights for African Americans. Okay, so we know that. All right, that's what we're going to talk about. Cool. What's the headings? Well, we only have one heading really, right? And that's the title because it's a very short article, very short piece of text. So we really don't have much of a heading to mess around with. We can move on to the introduction. And the introduction, that will be up here. So after the Civil War, African Americans were freed from slavery. However, many black men were still not allowed to vote. As a result, Congress passed the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1870. It states the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So from that introduction, we know that they're talking about something happened after the Civil War. We know that it's going to discuss the 15th Amendment. And it's going to discuss the meaning behind that because we saw that when we looked at this whole section here, which was a quote, a direct quote from the 15th Amendment. So that quote's going to get described, right? So we know that they're talking about voting rights for African Americans in regards to after the Civil War and the impact that the 15th Amendment had. We haven't even read the article yet, but we have a very good understanding of what's going on. So then the next E is every first sentence. So the first sentence of that intro, after the Civil War, African Americans were freed from slavery. Okay. The next paragraph. However, Southern states made voting nearly impossible for African Americans in the 1890s. All right. And the next one, literacy tests were another barrier. Barrier. And then finally, the rules kept black men from voting, and by 1892, fewer than 6% were registered to vote in Mississippi. So, every first sentence of the paragraphs, let's see, we know, again, African Americans were freed from slavery. African Americans are freed. We know that Southern states made it hard for African Americans to vote. And we know that literacy tests were a barrier. Literacy tests, barriers. Now, for those of you who don't understand about the literacy test and the barriers that they imposed, was essentially the literacy tests were worded intentionally awkward and difficult in some cases. And a lot of African Americans were unable to read, and the ones that could read weren't able to understand the language that was written in these literacy tests. And you had to pass that test in order to be allowed to vote. So of course they would make the literacy test very difficult to pass. That explains why there's a barrier, right? So the next one, V, that's vocabulary, remember? All right, so let's take a look at some vocabulary words. And again, in most texts, vocabulary is going to be bolded. Sometimes it'll be italicized, which is that little slant look. So here we have the vocabulary word allowed. We have the vocabulary word denied. We have the vocabulary word barrier. And last, interpret. All right. So without looking at the vocab and saying what it is, let's try to use some context clues. Allowed. Many black men were still not allowed to vote. So I would assume that in the context, allowed would mean, given the right to, being able to, right? For denied, it says, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So, denied. I would imagine that the word denied would mean said you can't do it, right? You're not allowed to, not being allowed, which was that other vocabulary word. And then you look at barrier. Literacy tests were another barrier. And the way it's worded, it doesn't seem like it's a good thing, but it would be a bad thing. And a barrier is a bad thing. It's stopping people from moving forward and doing what they need to do. And then finally, interpret. Let's look at the sentence and check it in context. In Mississippi, people who applied to vote had to read and interpret parts of the state constitution. So they had to read and interpret. So read's going to give you some clue here, isn't it? And interpret. So they're going to read it, but they also need to find a way of understanding it, understanding what it means, to interpret it. All right? So that was V for vocabulary, and V also stands for visuals, and I want to show you right here. Here's the visual. Rules of the state of Mississippi. You got to live in the state 2 years. You have paid all taxes by February 1st. Um, must pay an annual poll tax of $2 to the state and up to $1 to the county. Must be registered, and in order to do so, must be able to read any section of the state constitution and give a reasonable interpretation of it. Any person convicted of a serious crime is forever barred from voting. So I want you to think about some things looking at this visual. All right. If slavery was just done for, a lot of people either had just left their state or moved to a different state. So the likelihood of them being there for 2 years may not have been, they might have been there sooner than 2 years, right? Must have paid all taxes by February 1st. I would imagine it was hard to find a job if you're African American. Must pay an annual poll tax of $2 to the state and up to $1 to the county. How might that be difficult for African American? And then this section saying must be registered. In order to do so, must be able to read any section of the state constitution and give a reasonable interpretation of it. So you have to be able to read and understand the whole Constitution. And there are whole classes taught in high school about reading and interpreting the Constitution. So imagine if you didn't get a formal education, how difficult that task might be. And then any person convicted of a serious crime is forever barred from voting. Well, considering how things are now for African Americans and being convicted of crimes and the punishment being more harsh than the crime itself, I can only imagine how things were, way back during this time period when African Americans were kind of vilified by the South. So now we know, without even going deep into this thing, voting rights for African Americans, that's what this is going to be about. There wasn't really a heading, but we know it's talking about after the Civil War during the 15th Amendment. We know African Americans were freed, Southern states made it hard to vote, literacy was a barrier. We saw a visual about the rules of the state of Mississippi, so we know it's talking about Mississippi pretty much specifically, right? Or it's going to focus on that. The last E, end of chapter questions. Here are some questions. What did the 15th Amendment do? What was a poll tax? And what information can you get from text 2? Now, we haven't made it to text 2 yet, but at least you know that when you're reading this article, you want to know about the 15th Amendment. You want to focus on that. And you also want to focus on the poll tax. All right, so you know what to focus on while you're doing your reading. And then finally, the summary. You could try to sum this up yourselves. We kind of just gave a quick summary, didn't we, as we read down the list from our pre-reading. Now, pre-reading text number 2, that's going to be a little tricky because text 2 is so small. The title, it's adapted from What a Colored Man Should Do to Vote in Early 1900s Pamphlet. So from that, I know that in text 2, that it was a pamphlet. And it's instructions on what to do for African Americans. So instructions for African Americans to vote. Okay, sorry, you can't really see that, but so it's a pamphlet that had instructions for African Americans to vote. All right. So that's T. So H, the headings, there really aren't any headings again. Pretty much each paragraph, the intro says you cannot value too highly your right to vote, which is your choice of who will control your interests. So it's pretty much talking about value of voting. If I'm honest, you really can't do the pre-reading for this. It's so short, though, you shouldn't really need to do the pre-reading for this. Because, if we read every first sentence, every section is one sentence long, right? And then also, the vocabulary, well, there's emphasized is one of the vocabulary words. If you want to take a look at that in context and see what it means, it cannot be emphasized too strongly that nothing should influence your vote except a desire to serve the best interests of the country and your state. So it cannot be emphasized too strongly. To emphasize something, to point it out, to show its importance. And they're saying there's no way to overemphasize. It can't be emphasized enough. It can't be shown importance enough. That nothing should influence your vote except a desire to serve the best interests of the country and your state. To influence something, to kind of change it. You wanted to go to, McDonald's, but great Burger King commercials influenced you to go there instead. You might not have wanted to go out drinking tonight with the guys or the ladies, but someone influenced you to go ahead and go and have a good time. So if you're looking at text 1, it's very informative. It gives you all this information, right? And then text 2, it's pretty straightforward. It's a pamphlet with instructions for African Americans to vote. And then when you look at it, it's very short, it's very quick, very to the point. What I'd like you to do is to use this information to complete page 53. All right. And page 53 is a series of questions. The top is questions about, sorry about that. The top is questions about the article that you read. And then you're going to analyze purpose and point of view. So there's going to be a couple of more questions dealing with the point of view and the purpose of the different things that happen. And I would also like you to work on page 51, okay? And use the vocabulary and the answers in order to answer these questions. So number 1 says, what are some barriers to getting a college degree? And if you don't know what barriers mean, you look over here and say barrier. Something that blocks movement or gets in the way of action. So in other words, what are some things that block you from getting a college degree? And you want to write your answer down there. So do page 50 and page 53 for homework. And that's it for our reading and writing portion of class for now. I'm also going to post a YouTube video for that deals with the 15th Amendment. So be on the lookout for that as well. Have a great rest of your day.